Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Okay, so we're doing this again. It does feel like Groundhog Day. Trump called Iran's response to the framework set forward by the United States as totally unacceptable. So I figured maybe let's just start by recapping. Tell us just how far apart the two sides are, what they're both asking, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, okay, this is, um, I'll give you, it's a little bit hard to say like what the positions are from day to day or week to week, because again, I hear so many different reports, but I think essentially the positions haven't changed, or if there's been movement, there's just been very little movement. From the beginning, the U.S. has wanted to see restrictions or an elimination of the missile arsenal. Essentially, abolition, the ending of Iran's civilian nuclear program, an end to support to allies in the region, that's namely Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, the militias in Iraq. And now we have an additional one, of course, is the Strait of Hormuz, which wasn't a problem before, but that's it. So that's it. Now sometimes it seems like you get a different emphasis, from the American side. Recently, we've been hearing more and more, a real focus on just the nuclear program and not much talk about allies or the missile arsenal in particular. So it may be that there's, that they are showing some willingness to let go on that side. I'm not sure. It's really hard to say. On the Iranian side, of course, they put forward their 10-point plan, the one that Trump, at least nominally, or I don't even know if he knew what he was doing, but he apparently agreed to way back when the ceasefire began. And that 10-point plan includes reparations, continued control of the Strait of Hormuz by Iran, a right to civilian nuclear enrichment, to a civilian nuclear program, guarantees that they're not going to be attacked by the U.S. and Israel again, and continued support of their allies. And of course, a right to maintain a missile program, a conventional missile program. I think that's essentially, which, puts them very, very far apart. Now, the one thing that all along the Iranians have shown flexibility on. They have been firm. These are things that have been brought up. Some of them, like the missile program and relationship with allies, that has been brought up in previous negotiations prior to Trump. It was actually, something that was brought up in the negotiations that led to the JCPOA. But Iran has always remained firm on those, and I think we have to assume that they would. And of course, I think they would be insane not to. They were attacked. They knew that they were very vulnerable to attack. And the only thing that they have to really prevent an attack is this missile program. It is their allies. Why would you give these things up and make yourself vulnerable? Of course, now they have the Strait of Hormuz. That's an additional weapon that they have now. They've demonstrated. They've always had it there, but they've shown that they can really use it to great effect. They've always been firm on those. The one area where they have shown flexibility is their nuclear program. And that's what led to the JCPOA. They were flexible. They were willing to allow very extensive and intrusive inspections, more so than any other country in the world. You say, we have nothing to hide. We'll show this to you. And other restrictions. But they have also been very firm about their right to nuclear enrichment. This is about sovereignty. They do have a right to nuclear enrichment. I heard, I think it was Steve Witkoff saying that we went and told them that they had to give them. They said they had a right to it. It's like, Steve, you don't know anything. What an ignoramus.
Does Israel have a right to nuclear enrichment if it's not part of the NPT?
No.
And then nobody wants to bring that up? No, that doesn't get brought up at all?
Yeah, that's one thing, again, I think that the Iranians maybe should bring that up. I'm sure they do from time to time, but they haven't made that part of their core demands. I guess another thing I was mentioning about, part of the Iranian position, it also, and as what they've also been, recently since this war started, they say that when there is a ceasefire, it must extend to, other battlefronts, namely mainly Lebanon, which is very hot right now, and then Gaza too, which has slowed down but continues, and people do get killed there every day by the Israelis, and they're in a state of semi-starvation and deprivation, or very severe deprivation. That all continues. Let's not forget that, and that's something that Iran has made part of their requirements. But, going back to the nuclear, they have shown flexibility on that. And I think it's clear why. This is something, it's apart from sovereignty, for the Islamic Republic, that's part of what it was founded on, this idea of sovereignty. We're not going to be a creature of the great powers. We are going to be an independent state. We are a proud and independent civilization, so nobody can take away our sovereignty. And they do have a sovereign right to enrich uranium, and they're not going to give that up. That's something that they have said again and again. And I don't think they will, but they say, okay, there are other things, that we can negotiate about, the amounts and again, the nature and extent of inspections. Those are all things that we can show flexibility on, and they have in the past. And I've heard that recently they did again. They were saying, I think not too long ago, okay, we're not going to let any of our enriched uranium out of the country. But the most recent report said, okay, maybe we will let it, we will allow a transfer of a certain amount of our enriched uranium. And they have everything from 3.67% up to 60%. To a third country. And I think that's probably Russia, as that's been done in the past. Again, they have shown flexibility. Another thing is there's this talk about a moratorium. Recently, I guess it was Islamabad, the U.S. demanded 20 years. Okay, stop it, enriching uranium for 20 years. And the Iranians came back with 5. But they may be willing, and I've heard again that maybe they're open to something like maybe 10 years, something in that neighborhood. And why would they be willing to do that? Because they do have a lot of enriched uranium. They have tons of it, at the lower level, and then they have 440 kilograms, which is to say, nearly 1,000 pounds of it at 60%. And that 60% that's a much higher concentration than what you need for a civilian program. So they said, we're willing to dilute it, and then we're going to have lots and lots of this enriched uranium. We can run our program, without enriching new uranium for a certain number of years. Maybe they can do it for 10 years or longer. I'm not quite sure exactly what it would be. So that's something, again, where they can be flexible on. And apparently they have, again, shown flexibility there. But the other things, they have always been firm on allies and on their missile arsenal. I think the reasons are clear. And I think that for similar reasons, they are going to insist on a certain amount of control over the Strait of Hormuz. That's feel like that is where they have the U.S. at a disadvantage. And I don't think they're going to give up that weapon. Now, of course, on the other side, the Americans are quite upset, and that's why, because it looks like they're going to end up with, essentially, less than what they came with. Prior to this attack on February 28th, the Iranians were talking about, even more, I think, greater concessions on the nuclear program. And they weren't even they didn't have control of the Strait of Hormuz. And certainly they didn't talk about reparations. Which reparations, that reminds me, there's also sanctions, that the very, very important part of it. They want sanctions relief, and they want the unfreezing of all those funds that the U.S. and the West froze. That it's their money. It's essentially been stolen, and they want it back. Their demands have become actually more stringent, and numerous since this war. And this, obviously looks pretty bad. You say you launched a war, you make a deal. It's a worse deal than what you could have easily had before the war. How do you explain that? Well, that's where we are, and that's why Trump is in such a fix. And he doesn't clearly he doesn't like it, but I don't know. I think in the end, well, uh, it would make sense for him to actually. It would be a very bad option for him in the U.S., but it's actually the best option they have. But for various reasons that we've discussed in the past, I don't think he can even do that.
Yeah, what's different about the state of negotiations here as opposed to when we were talking about Russia and Ukraine or Russia and the United States, we said these two sides were miles apart. There's no way they're going to come close. But both sides are able to just kind of keep things going. What's different here with Iran is that we have a ticking clock. And Trump is saying that this is totally unacceptable, but this clock is ticking. And this means that at some point, the global strategic reserves are going to hit rock bottom. I saw a headline from Financial Times last week said global oil reserves plunge at record pace. And so we know that and this is across the board. All these countries are just expending all their global strategic oil reserves. So how much time is left on that clock right now? And what happens when when it hits zero?
Right. It's okay. There are the U.S. has, for example, the SPR Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and we're drawing 1 million barrels out of that every day, is my understanding. There's still a lot in it, but you can't go to the bottom. I think I mentioned earlier, it's actually the oil is kept in salt caverns, and you need to maintain a certain amount of oil in there. Otherwise, the caverns start to collapse, and you have some real problems. So I don't know exactly how far they can go, but there is a limit. Some months. I don't know now. But there's not just the strategic reserves. There's also the inventories of the oil companies, and that's actually pretty extensive and been an important part of what's been going on. Which has been cushioning the blow. Again, we have seen a sharp rise in gas prices, but it's nothing compared to what it might have been if it wasn't for these reserves and inventories. Now, I hear that the inventories actually are supposed to run out. We're supposed to hit the bottom of the tanks in the U.S. here at within 2 months approximately. And I don't think the strategic reserve, again, I was recently reading some analysts' work, is much too far behind that. But if we will get a shock, first of all, when those inventories run out, and that's not very far from the present. And there's that cushion that's gone. Now we're in it's really a crazy situation. We are, in fact, the U.S. is exporting oil right now. And because of these inventories and the strategic reserve, it's made our prices very attractive for buyers around the world. And so they are coming and buying up our oil. It's a much higher price than it would have been if it was coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, but it's what's there. So this is leading to our own inventories and strategic reserve to be drawn down even more rapidly, which is just crazy. It doesn't seem like a very sensible policy, but that's what's happening. Again, there's just no restrictions on our oil companies, and they're just looking at ways to make money and take advantage of the situation.
For other countries like China, for example, they are not selling their oil on the market, right? This is something that they're holding domestically to make prices lower in China and life more affordable and livable, right? So that they don't absorb the shock right away. Is the U.S. the only one that's actually exporting its oil reserves to try to reduce the global price of oil and keep things suppressed?
Yeah, well, I don't know that they're doing that in order to reduce the global price of oil, or it's just that the oil companies are taking advantage. The oil companies are free to act as they want now. They're not under any restrictions. Now, that may change at some point. They may be, put under, restrictions the way other, oil companies have in, I believe, Russia, for example. Now, of course, there's a big difference. The U.S. is a major, in fact, the world's leading producer of oil. We do actually import more than we do produce, when it comes to crude oil. But the margin it's not that great a difference. China is very much an importer. And so they don't have that luxury. They can't actually be exporting oil. Now they have actually exported and are exporting jet fuel to certain countries, that were in dire need of it, like Vietnam. I know that's one of them. And because they do refine, They do have the refining capacity to produce a lot of jet fuel with the crude oil that they have, and they do have extensive reserves. So to help out these countries, and I think just to tighten their relationships with these countries, they are helping them out. And again, Vietnam is one that I'm specifically aware of. Now, though they're not exporting oil, China has apparently reduced its imports of oil by 3.5 million barrels a day, which is significant. That's having a real impact on world markets. It doesn't, eliminate the crisis, but it does soften the blow somewhat, at least in this, the short term. That's now I'm not quite sure. The argument has been made is that they're doing this to provide a kind of a public good to the global oil markets, again, to boost their standing in the
It's just soft power.
Yeah, so that's a possibility, but they have to be able to do that. I guess that they're looking at their situation and they think that they have sufficient reserves and they can ride this out, and they have Russia to back them up, and so on and so forth. So I think they feel like they have room to maneuver, and they have made this cut, and that is having an impact. We're talking about, because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, something like 12 million barrels of oil have been taken off the market a day, which is huge. Again, a much greater shock than any oil shock in the past. Now that has been mitigated somewhat by this decision of, significantly, you go from 12 million to 8.5 million. Still, that's huge, but it's not quite as huge. And so this Chinese action has provided an additional cushion. We don't know how long it'll go on. It doesn't resolve the crisis, but it does affect let's say, the ticking of the clock. The clock will tick a little bit slower because of this, if they continue to do this.
Okay. Is it the right way to look at it as a ticking clock, that it hits a certain point and then all of a sudden it's crisis mode? Or are we just going to see this actually be kind of like a gradual increase, and then one thing start to draw down, then the alarm bells start ringing, and then you start to see it go off?
Yeah, I think we're going to see sharp spikes. The price of oil, certainly in the futures market we've talked about, should be a lot higher than it is. I hear the spot price of oil, it's like we're talking about immediate transactions now are at approximately $140 a barrel, which again, is lower than where it would be if it wasn't for all these moves to try to cushion the effects, at least in the short term, the drawing down of inventories and the strategic reserves and so forth. So there's that. The price of gasoline, really should be higher than it is. But again, we're trying to put off the inevitable. And the effect of putting off the inevitable is that when the inevitable arrives, then you get a really sharp spike, a sharper spike than you would have otherwise. So like when we get to the bottoms of the tanks of the inventories, then we're going to see a sharp spike. And similar things, it's not just the U.S. These are things that are happening. This is playing out all around the world. Again, we'll probably be affected later than everybody's already affected, of course. But, the spike will come later to us than it will in other parts of the world. It's already happened in parts of Asia, and it'll happen sooner in Europe than it does here. Right?
So are you looking at a time frame of weeks or months when this tidal wave begins to hit?
Yeah, well, I think it's, again, I'm dependent. It's on what I've read from these analysts. More than one analyst has pointed to July as a critical month, where we're going to see, I think, inevitably, where reality is going to hit hard. And it may be that it's like what happens with real tidal waves, tsunamis. There's usually not just one wave. There's a series of waves. And, we've already, maybe you could say a smaller one is hit. There's going to be a larger one and then a larger one. To kind of extend the metaphor here, you could say that, again, prior to the arrival of a tsunami, the water will recede. There's actually this period of calm, and people will say, "Well, this is interesting. Let's walk out on the beach. Go down, look at the tidal pools and that kind of thing." And then, of course, the wave happens. So that's kind of what's happening now. It's not a perfect analogy, um, but because of all these clear efforts to suppress prices in the short run, there is a false sense of calm, that, but doesn't prevent the tsunami from arriving. And actually, when the tsunami arrives, it's going to be all the more devastating.
So when this tsunami arrives, the clock runs out. Will this force a decision by Trump? And do you think that it will actually take the tsunami hitting for an actual decision to be made, whether to make major concessions and move their position much closer to Iran so that some type of deal is possible? Or, of course, we talk. We'll get into that.
Well, it could be, clearly, Trump is flailing now. I think we saw that. We saw that with Project Freedom that was declared roughly a week ago, or, a little bit more than a week ago, and then went into effect approximately a week ago and lasted all of 36 hours. That was an attempt to do something to, provide some sort of immediate relief. And obviously it failed. And, we got that report again. It was because of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And then I think there was some disinformation that followed that and said that, oh, no, they were angry that we, weren't hard enough on the Iranians and not standing up for UAE. And I think that was a bunch of nonsense. But yeah, in any case, it failed. It lasted just for a few hours. And it's a sign of, I think of desperation, really, and an awareness that they don't have really any solution to this problem, right? It's just like whatever they do is just going to be, it's going to make matters worse. And, I think that we all understand that right now. And then... So Trump is, here sputtering. He's probably looking at different plans and whatever, but he maybe, he's learned that, hopefully he's learning to distrust some of these people that say, oh yeah, go for it. This really works, because they have failed him in the past. They failed him big time with this war, right? I think whatever happened around Isfahan, that failed, that Project Freedom appears to have failed. And he may, therefore just say, well, I'll just have to believe that we can crush them. We'll just hold off and that they'll eventually cave in. Some people are telling me that, it's maybe better not to act than to act, because, again, it's just the consequences have been immediate, and there's a chance that things get a lot worse. I don't know to what extent he's thinking rationally at all, but eventually, he is in pain. Let's put it that way. The polls are very, very bad for him. For him personally, polls on the war, again, there's disapproval ratings are much higher than approval ratings. He still has like a bare majority within his Republicans, like on the war, but it's not a very large majority. That's a really bad, that's terrible, for a wartime president. He is in real trouble, and he, if nothing else, he understands polls, and he doesn't, he wants to get out of this. So he's looking for some kind of out, again, and it's just, as we discussed, he may eventually go for some crazy plan because he feels like he just doesn't have a choice, and he may.
When you say crazy plan, you're talking about a military plan, some military option.
Yeah, right. I don't know what else. Just like we still, the folks on Fox News are still talking about Karg Island, or renewing the bombing. Say, one argument that's put out there is, and I'm sure that Trump is hearing about from certain advisors, is that, okay, now they're hurting because of your blockade on their ports. And if we go back in and bomb, the combination of the 1-2 punch is going to be fatal. They will come begging for mercy. He hasn't gone for it yet. One thing that I'm sure is affecting his timing is this upcoming trip to China. It's supposed to take place on Thursday, if I remember correctly. And I think that means it's unlikely for him to do anything in the very near term. I don't know that he would, if he has some sort of, if he's going to try some sort of, you know, ground assault or renewed air assault or something, it will probably follow. I would think, you can never be sure with Trump, but I think it would probably follow this visit to China.
Right. The other thing as well is if he does opt for some military path, any military option would just immediately make that clock rapidly hit zero, right? Because Iran still has more capability to take more energy, more critical resources off the market. The Red Sea route, for example, the Houthis could shut that down if Iran wanted to do that. They could destroy what remaining infrastructure is left in the Gulf states. And then we're talking about permanent erasure of these, or at least semi 5 years or something of erasure of these of oil from the market or something like this.
Right.
So do you think that he would, that's also restraining him, that he's like, well, I can't do this militarily because then all of a sudden, my whole thing that I'm stressed about is that this clock is ticking. If I do any type of military option, then you just fast forward it to zero.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that's right. And I'm sure there are people within the administration that are telling him that. And I'm sure that maybe with the exception of the UAE, the monarchs of the Gulf states are telling him that. And we got some, evidence of that when he launched his Project Freedom. He thought maybe Project Freedom was something sort of in between that might just work out, wouldn't provoke the Iranians, to carry out on their threats to destroy infrastructure, and then maybe would have some success, maybe increase the number of ships getting through. Again, the thing fell apart very quickly, but that was seen to be, it showed, let's say, a certain amount of caution. It showed desperation on one side, but also maybe an awareness that, okay, we really can't go back to where we were. And I hope, that awareness, if it indeed is there, remains.
Right. So a military option, it doesn't seem viable. If it is, it's going to be a loss of lives, and it could destroy energy markets even more. The other option is any type of diplomatic option, and then this could potentially be one of the reasons why Trump is going to China. Trump is expected to confront Xi Jinping about China's support for Iran. How do you think this will go over? Is there any type of diplomatic option here by approaching these other great powers?
He's not going to get some sort of grand deal or anything like that from Xi Jinping. Again, I think Trump is incapable of that. I'm sure he is going to ask for a lot of things, and maybe I really don't know what goes on behind these closed doors here. I imagine that Xi Jinping, I assume that Xi Jinping, understands what kind of man Trump is. And he's probably going to see that Trump is, the way that he's going to look at it is that Trump is in a great deal of trouble. And maybe there's something, I can get out of it without sacrificing something, that's at all, essential to us or to the, the long-term viability of Iran. I don't think that the Chinese or the Russians want any way to really, put Iran at, in some kind of, put the continued existence of its state at risk. I'm sure of that. I think that they want Iran. They do want Iran clearly to survive and to emerge whole when this is over. So I don't think he's going to give up anything that's going to put that at risk at all. Or be anything that's vital to Chinese interests. But who knows, it's a complicated world. There's all kinds of things. Trump is desperate. Maybe they can achieve some kind of, not anything like a big deal, but, agree on something, I think similar to what we've seen, between the Russians and the Americans. look, there hasn't been any kind of treaty. We're never going to have a settlement of the conflict. Again, I think the U.S. is incapable of doing it. The Russians, I think, Putin in particular, is maybe kind of foolish to think that they could achieve it. Now they understand they can't, but still they maintain communications with Trump, and sometimes they get things out of him. Like for example, um, they got a reversal on the Tomahawk decision. It looked like the U.S. was going to supply Tomahawks, and I'm sure the Russians could deal with it, but it's something they would rather not deal with. It is an escalation. It does create risks, and could lead to a real expansion of the conflict. And apparently after a phone call, it was off the table. It's something that they got, something concrete, something significant, not a settlement or anything like that. And then we hear that, now the Germans are not going to get Dark Eagle or the Tomahawks or the Typhoon launchers. Maybe that was something that was worked out. Again, I don't know if the Russians gave anything up for it, but those kind of deals I think are possible. And I don't know what it would be for the Chinese. But I think that that's what they're looking. Okay, here's this person who's desperate. Maybe with Trump, it's more like, okay, what for Trump, it's all about image and ego. We'll give him some sort of boost to his ego, and we'll get something concrete in return. Perhaps that's what's going to happen.
Do you see that as? Are you hopeful at all with this meeting with China that somehow China could help get Trump out of this fix? Because China obviously does not want the U.S. to go back in and destroy the global energy markets for the next 10 years. So it's in everybody's interest to avoid this conflict.
Right.
So I'm wondering if there's some possibility that if the Chinese look at this framework, okay, we need to, still support Iran, respect their sovereignty, but we need to give some way for Trump to paint this as some type of win just so he can take it and leave. And I'm just wondering, is that possible? Does that option exist?
Yeah, I think that it's in truth, it doesn't. That this has been a big L for the United States and for Trump, and there's just no way to hide that fact. To anybody who again is paying any attention at all to this, but there are gradations below. You can't avoid certain degrees of humiliation. By who knows, through expert manipulation of the narrative, or, maybe some minor face-saving concessions provided by Iran. Looking at it, it's true that the Chinese, again, they're very influential. Both, they have influence and they have obvious leverage with the United States and with Iran. They want this war to end. They don't like the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is closed, even though they are continuing to get some oil out of it, a reduced flow. But at the same time, they don't want Iran, to go down. They want Iran to stand and survive. So they have an incentive for some kind of, to provide some sort of off-ramp. Let's just put it that way, for Trump. I don't know what they can work out, if it's possible at all, but I imagine that they're going to try to persuade him, to just get out of there if he can't make a deal. And I don't think he really can. And maybe they'll make some promises about, again, perhaps just in, when it comes to, maybe, promises to provide him with some sort of cover. It's just maybe nothing substantial. We're talking again about just the world of image, some sort of face-saving measures that they can carry out, or they can, some sort of, I don't know what it was, but these are people who are creative and they're looking at it, from many different angles. And perhaps there's something they can offer them that to say, hey, if you do leave here soon, we can help you in this way. We'll say this and we'll do that. And we'll get the Iranians to, to maybe not crow about a victory and whatever, just something, do a little bit just to make it, less painful. Look, my friend, you got yourself in a fix right here. It's no matter what, let's admit it. You made a mistake. You got to get out of there. We'll make it a little bit easier for you to get out of there. Maybe that's what's going to happen. That would be my guess.
Well, Qatar gave Trump that Boeing 747. That really tickled him pink. Maybe if China just gives him like 2 Boeing 747s and just
Yeah,
say,
and
forget
played it
everything
in
else.
gold or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Well, they wouldn't give him Boeing 747s. I think they got their own native
right.
industry now.
Well, he'd be happy with that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to hope that is possible, that China does have a lot of leverage and perhaps they can concoct some way out. But the big question, of course, is that there's one party that just does not want this war to end. And there's this question is who does have the ultimate say on whether this war can end or not.
Yeah.
And I'm going to play you a clip with with Netanyahu on 60 Minutes, and we can talk about it right after.
Okay.
Is the war with Iran over? And if it isn't, who will decide when it is?
I think it accomplished a great deal, but it's not over because there's still nuclear material, enriched uranium that has to be taken out of Iran. There's still enrichment sites that have to be dismantled. There's still proxies that Iran supports. There are ballistic missiles that they still want to produce. Now, we've degraded a lot of it, but all of that is still there, and there's work to be done.
How do you envision the highly enriched uranium will be removed from Iran?
You go in and you take it out.
With what? Special forces from Israel? Special forces from the United States?
Well, I'm not going to talk about military means, but what President Trump has said to me, I want to go in there. And I think it can be done physically. That's not the problem. If you have an agreement and you go in and you take it out, why not? That's the best way.
What if there isn't an agreement? Can it be taken out by force?
Well, you're going to ask me these questions. I'm going to dodge them because I'm not going to talk about our military possibilities, plans, or anything of the kind.
And I'm just trying to get at how long is it going to take to achieve that aim?
I'm not going to give a timetable to it, but I'm going to say that's a terrifically important mission.
So he says the Iran war isn't over. And the big question is, does he get to decide when it's over? And obviously for him, his goal, it's only over with Iran essentially destroyed, with the U.S. doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that has been the Israeli position from the beginning. They haven't budged on it a bit. And again, it has to be emphasized, it's not just Netanyahu. He there is fairly representing the entire Israeli security establishment, the IDF. That is their position, without exception. And again, that's 74% of Jewish Israelis support this too. Now, again, as I pointed out last time, when you say, okay, well, what if the U.S. pulls out? Do you want to continue the war? That drops to 14% with the public anyway. So they want the U.S. to stay in. Yeah, very. There's just so many things to torpedo this. I know. There's just you have Israel. It's just all. What a terrible jam Trump has gotten himself into. It's just like there is absolutely no good move here for him. I think the best one is for him just to leave, because it's just not possible. I mean, even if he had a competent negotiating team, which he does not have, even if he had the patience, even if he understood how these kind of highly technical negotiations are carried out, and he was committed to it, which he's not, because he clearly just doesn't have, he has the mind of a 3-year-old sometimes. It seems like he's just this impatience and this idea that, it's just a matter of threats, and that's just not how you do these things. He just doesn't understand. But let's just pretend that he does, that he did understand, and that he had a competent team or whatever. Still, I don't think there's any chance. They're too far apart. The sanctions are obviously very important to to Iran. And look, even Obama didn't, make good on the sanctions promise on the U.S. part of the JCPOA. Congress will never let it happen. The Iranians have no reason to trust the U.S. There's just not going to be an agreement. There's just not. I can just say that. There may be some, at the most we'll get a memorandum of understanding or some declaration that we're heading towards an agreement, something that Trump calls an agreement, but we'll never have a real agreement. That's just not going to happen. This is not going to be settled, unfortunately. Certainly not with this administration. We're not going to have a real settlement. The best thing that the U.S. could do is walk away. That's something that Joe Kent argues, and I think he's correct. He says, he said that actually, like, the majority of Americans believe that we won this war. I think he's talking about Republicans. I want to look at the polls. No, most Americans think that we lost this war, but there's a bare majority among Republicans. But still, he could leave. Trump will pretend that he won the war, just walk away, say this, okay, the Strait of Hormuz doesn't matter for us. Actually, it does, very much so. But it matters less for us in other parts of the world. And then, again, it would be a disaster, but I think it would be the smallest disaster. But there's so many things going against it. And you just saw one of them, probably the most important thing. That was Netanyahu and everything that he represents. They will not, they are going to fight like hell to prevent that from happening.
Right, right. You said earlier with Iran that this was about their sovereignty, their civilian nuclear enrichment program, that they won't kneel to any other powers, that they have their civilizational state, and they are proud of that, and they're not going to submit. But it brings me to this question, though, after watching that clip with Netanyahu: is the U.S. or the Western world sovereign? I don't think so. If we're not able to make these decisions, and you just said here, the biggest one, everything that Netanyahu represents, is the reason why, one of the main reasons that we won't be able to walk away and can't do it, because, and then by definition, we are not a sovereign country. And I think neither is the rest of the whole U.S. empire. They are not sovereign either. We see what happens in Europe. We see what happens with Japan, South Korea. Being associated with the United States means you're not sovereign. But the United States itself doesn't appear to be sovereign. So what does that mean? That this is a very interesting situation that we're in, where the most powerful alliance in the world is never, but there's no sovereignty there. There's no core power. Or is the power structure really located in Tel Aviv? If Israel has that amount of control over the United States on whether or not it can leave this catastrophic war.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't put it quite that strongly. We do have sovereignty, we do have freedom to act, and we do recklessly without regard to. Let me reframe it, actually. Okay, go ahead.
I would say maybe Trump doesn't have sovereignty. It seems to be clear, whether it's being compromised from the Epstein files or something like this. This administration clearly does not have sovereignty. It does seem to have been outsourced to Tel Aviv.
Right. Again, I would say that it's not not in all matters. We do have sovereignty when it comes to, let's say, relations with other countries in the Americas, and vis-a-vis Europe and Asia too. It's there where their loss of sovereignty is vis-a-vis us, right? As you pointed out earlier. The problem is when it comes to the Middle East. And that obviously is the influence of the Israel lobby. And I would say that, okay, I don't know about Epstein, if that's there. That's certainly a possibility. But I don't think we even need to insist on that, because we can see, the influence that the lobby has on Trump. He was elected with their help. He has these close relations with the mega donors. Thanks to their advice, he's appointed all these people around him that are diehard Israel firsters. And so, even if he would like to have sovereignty, I think the big problem is, he made this bargain with the devil, and he's too weak to get out of it. That he likes to project this aura of strength, but he's actually a weak president in so many ways. Previous presidents have gone along and bent, to the Israel lobby, to a great extent. They've done almost everything that they were asked to do by this lobby. But when it came to Iran, they had enough sense, and they heard about the Strait of Hormuz problem was explained to them, and the missile arsenal, et cetera, what might happen to the bases. These are all things that this wasn't arcane knowledge. We were aware of it, for example, and we talked about it. And I'm sure that there are smart people. We know that there are, because that's what actually Obama and Kerry himself said about a previous effort by the Israelis to push the U.S. into war. But what Obama was weak in so many ways vis-a-vis Israel, but he had the strength and the sense to say no. Trump didn't. I think Trump is actually, again, he likes to have project this aura of strength. He's the man who's really in charge, but he's not. I think partly because he has such a weak grasp of the facts. He's so emotional in so many ways, and he's easy to manipulate as a consequence of that. And he's surrounded by these people, these Israel firsters. So yeah, he has. Well, in essence, when it comes to the Middle East, we have lost our sovereignty. It had been greatly diminished in the past, but it's almost gone right now. We're just kind of hoping against hope that he'll just somehow break out of this cage that he's put himself into, or allowed himself to be put into, by all the Israel firsters.
To me, it just feels like things are set in motion and we are just powerless to stop it. It seems like Trump himself is powerless to stop it. And it's hard to imagine that that's the case we're in, but when perhaps that's often how these conflicts start. I'm thinking like World War I, Franz Ferdinand gets shot, and then things just start getting set in motion and nobody can stop it. And then what happens is this absolute catastrophe. And I'm afraid that we're in one of these situations now. It's like we see the iceberg, and to me, we talk about it all the time. It's just like, okay, well, let's just, change direction, turn the ship a little bit, but no, it just keeps moving forward. And it makes me think that we are going to hit it. We're talking, and it's quite depressing. Like, what is the point of us even having these discussions? Like nothing awareness doesn't seem to matter. Things just seem to be set in motion, and we just have to go along for the ride. So maybe we should just change this podcast and we talk about football or something. At least it'll be maybe a little bit more positive and more fun, because if this is just going to hit us, it's almost like, what's the point? I'm becoming, just so cynical now. I just can't, it's not good for everyone's mental health. We all see this problem happening. Right. Nobody can resolve it.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to have any effect on the administration, on the political class here or in Europe or anything. But, what we and other, people in the dissident media, what we can do, I think, is actually to provide some kind of understanding. The more people that understand what's going on, the better. So that when, the Titanic hits the iceberg, they will know why it hit the iceberg. And they will know, what are potential solutions. They'll be ready for the day after. I think the worst thing that could happen is that, okay, we hit the iceberg, we have a disaster. You can, this is already a disaster, but we haven't felt the full impact of it. Okay, the disaster, the tsunami hits, maybe a series of tsunamis hit. What do people do? Who do they point their finger at? How do they explain it? And that's very important. They need to have some kind of understanding so that we don't go down the same road again, or we don't compound the disaster with further idiocies. I think we can say we're preparing for the day after. We're trying to lay the groundwork for the day after.
Well, the day after is terrifying, because what are we talking about? Like, there's sometimes this thought enters my mind as well, that if the elites, they're all about their own self-preservation and they have total control, and they don't really care about the global economy or just the average everyday citizen trying to support their family, that they have underground bunkers and they're ready, and they're like, you know what? Worst case scenario, we do a great reset. Who cares if half of the world gets wiped out? We'll be okay. Where everyone's complaining about gas prices, demand. Well, what if we wipe out half the people? That will reduce demand, and then we'll be okay. I don't know. It's just, we're at this point where we're talking about, potentially using a nuclear weapon, if there's no viable military option, there's no viable diplomatic option.
Right.
But then what does a nuclear weapon achieve? Like what are we talking when we get to this point? This doesn't solve your problem. What you're saying is that maybe we just need to have some just burn it all down and we will be safe. And that'll stop everybody screaming at me and saying, Trump, what are you doing wrong? Because most of them will be dead and then everything will get lost in the flames. Like, I know how morbid and apocalyptic this sounds, but hey, just the fact that that thought enters my mind just shows you just where we are.
Right. Well, that is pretty morbid. But I can understand exactly what you thought. When we look at the kind of people that are in charge, obviously people like Netanyahu, they don't give a damn. I mean, the half the world could starve and they don't care. And I think the Israelis really don't give a damn about the global economy or anything. Or, in the future, certainly the future of the Gulf states. Yeah, they would like to maintain some kind of relationship with UAE and Bahrain, which they already have. But that's just not essential for that. It's their own survival. Now, I think in the end, it's foolish. I think it's a mistake. I think sometimes we make a mistake to say, okay, that they're sort of like puppet masters and they control everything and they're really in charge and they have plans. Their own hubris and their own inability to understand what other people think, like the Iranians, or the Russians or whatever, actually does lead them into disasters. I don't think these are not where they really wanted to be. This is a disaster for Israel too, but Israel's thinking is that we just have to keep on going, maybe all the way to nuclear weapons. That's because we can't back out. Russia was a disaster too. It was their mistake. I think, because these individuals are wealthy and powerful, and they do have their bunkers in apparently in Argentina and in New Zealand and other places like that. Perhaps unfortunately, a lot of them will do okay in some potentially chaotic times that may be not too far off. But I don't think they can. I think it would be a mistake to think that they really can. That they are so. Let's say just that they are invincible. They're not. And I think we've actually seen, they are actually in a much worse position in so many ways than they were just a few years ago. They had a much better control of the situation not too long ago. Now, the fact is that we're talking about them, we're seeing them, and people see Netanyahu for what he is, and people understand that, our power is not unlimited. We just learned that beginning with the Ukraine war. All of these things have been damaging to them. And they are, they're going to fight back and they're going to try to hold on. But let's not assume that they're going to come out on top. I think in the end, their days are numbered. That's my belief, but I understand your dark thoughts, because these are evil people and they do have a lot of power.
Right. And if they think they're going down, we know, will they take a bunch down with them? If this hantavirus or whatever it is suddenly gets really a lot more virulent all of a sudden, I'm going to be pretty suspicious. I'm like, all right, what's going on? Are we trying to wipe out half the world now? Is that what's that the plan here?
No comment.
Okay. All right. Well, I know you wanted to talk. Do you want to talk a little bit about Russia, or I have some questions about just sort of Navy, Air Force? What do you prefer?
Okay, well, maybe start with your questions, and we'll see.
Okay, well, I was just kind of thinking about how Trump always is touting that he's completely obliterated Iran's navy, but the fact remains that the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and the U.S. Navy can't get close to the Iranian coast. So, what does this really mean for navies in this day and age? Do they have a function really at this point, or other than sort of logistics or support? I mean, what is the purpose of a navy? Because this is where a lot of our budget goes to. We have these massive aircraft carriers. They cost $8 million to run per day, just to run, not even when they're engaged in combat.
Yeah. Well, I think, there's no question about it. Surface navies have become very vulnerable. And we can see it. We can see it actually in the Ukraine war. Well, the Ukrainian Navy, which wasn't very substantial, it was wiped out at the beginning of the war. Now, and the Russian Navy was forced to withdraw, from it had its main port there in Sevastopol, and they were forced to go farther east and south because they're vulnerable. Now, the Russians still use them. They use them as a launch platform, but they have to be cautious. And we see the same thing with the Americans. They just, in general, their naval vessels stay off like 300, 350 kilometers at least. The aircraft carriers even farther. We saw how they were vulnerable in the Red Sea to the Houthis. Again, not a major power, the poorest country in the Arab world. They are very vulnerable. I guess what they still have a function, but it seems like they have a function more as almost like a Coast Guard or in like pre-war situations. Let's say, for example, recently the Russians have been providing escorts to convoys of tankers. It's sort of like, it's here we have our ships. We actually, I think they know that Britain probably does have some anti-ship missiles provided by the USA would be capable of taking them out, but they know they're not going to. It's just like, it's okay, here, you can actually dare to go to war with us. No, I don't think so. And that's kind of like they can be a show of force in that kind of situation. And they do serve a purpose. They're helping to protect these convoys. But in an actual war situation, their role becomes very doubtful. And it would be certainly true in the case of, let's say a contest with Russia directly or with China. I think both of them have anti-ship missiles that can strike, far thousands of kilometers away. And, again, they have many of them. There's just, you can have a certain number of defenses, but all defenses can be overcome. And, when we're talking about hypersonic missiles, that even the best defenses, are useless. They're defenseless, right? So it's not that, they do have a role, but the role is really very limited. And we can see it like in this current war in Iran, those ships have to stay off. They are, those aircraft carriers do provide a platform for an attack on Iran because Iran doesn't have the robust, highly integrated air defenses that, let's say, Russia does. But it does limit the, what the U.S. can do with its Air Force. These planes have to fly a great distance. That means that they're that the time that they can actually engage in a combat mission is very limited. They've got to turn around and head back. I think again, if I were any country, I would. It's not to say I wouldn't have a navy, but I would reduce my naval budget extensively. I wouldn't invest heavily in building up a navy. Now, it has to be said that the Chinese have done that. Are they foolish to do that? I don't know. Maybe again, there are functions that this navy can serve. We're talking about the possibility that they may at some point start escorting tankers into the Strait of Hormuz, and I'm sure they're considering that. And that's they can do that. It's sort of like a challenge to a power. Are you really going to try to attack our naval vessels? You know what that might mean. And I think we say no. And so, there's a use for it. They have even built aircraft carriers. Maybe I'm wrong and they have such wonderful air defense that they'll be able to protect these aircraft carriers. But I think that actually, the Russians are going the right way. I think they have one aircraft carrier that's pretty much, it has seen better days and is on the way out, and that's it. And they're not investing in a new one. What they're investing in is their submarine fleet and then, some smaller ships. And I think that's the way to go. I think
Right.
that really is wise.
Right. I mean, if you look at what Iran done, it's these fast speed boats and these little tiny submarines.
Right.
It seems like, and if you're not trying to project power, it becomes a lot easier.
Right.
You're just saying these little boats
Yeah.
are harder to hit. They're very cheap, easy to maintain. But I think this is part of the problem, I think, just with the U.S. military industrial complex in general, is that these programs are too entrenched. So we keep on creating things that are no longer viable in today's day and age. And I wonder if we'll be able to make that adjustment, that change, but it doesn't seem like we are. It seems that, Trump is talking about his golden fleet. France is wanting to build a new aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
Like, so it just, you're wondering, like, why is this, what is this happening when it becomes clearer and clearer when you observe modern conflicts that navies are more of a liability. Like you said, maybe in pre-war times for escorting, it's almost like they're almost a tripwire. Dare you? Do you want to, if you hit our ships, you know what this means, like you said. But in terms of an actual combat purpose, we're not going to see big naval battles where ships are firing at each other. This isn't going to be, the Battle of Midway or anything like this. We're not going to have stuff like that anymore.
Yeah, no, I think, it's their glory days are past. I think there's no question about that. It's going to be submarines and surface drones and underwater drones. That's where we are. And that's what, the Iranians understand that. And that's why, we have all this tremendous naval power, but in the end, we can't really do anything. And all our efforts, you just think about it, it's actually comical. It's just when the U.S., or not rather the U.S., but Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, we started getting a kind of a temper tantrum from Trump, and his threat said he was going in. He had instructed the Navy to go in the next day. The Navy said, we're not going in,
Right.
They understand. And then it's like, it's the Europeans are going to go in, we're telling them, and they said, we're not going in. That tells you what's happened here.
Right. Right. What's the point of the Navy is what I'm asking. Like, what are we doing? We still have the most powerful Navy in the world.
Right. Well, against weaker countries, but that, even that's limited, because I think all those weaker countries, so-called, around the world are looking at what's happened in Iran. And they're going to say, hey, that's the way to go. Forget the Navy. We have to buy the ship from the U.S. for $1 billion. And we're going to have a fleet. It's going to be billions. It takes us years or decades to build it up. Yeah, let's go with mini submarines and speedboats. And, anyone who's thinking pragmatically, that's what they're going to be doing. I think that the Iranians have actually kind of provided the template. And I'm sure, like all around the world, and again, any leadership that is pragmatic and intelligent, they're just looking at the Iranian model and making plans accordingly.
Right. And I mean, we're kind of seeing this synergy as well between Russia and Iran. Like, for example, we're seeing Hezbollah using these fiber optic drones to great effect against Israel's Merkava tanks and their ground troops. They are really getting chewed up in southern Lebanon because there's nothing they can do. And you're wondering, well, where did they get that idea for the fiber optic drones? Well, I'm pretty sure that Russia has helped Iran, and Iran supplied that information to Hezbollah.
I think that's very likely, yes. Right.
And one last question. I do feel like the navies are obsolete, but I'm also feeling the same thing about the Air Force, or we need to redefine what an Air Force is. Air Force, really, we just think about how many F-35s you have, how many F-18s you put in the air. But should we really think about the Air Force as really the modern Air Force is a missile force and drone force? That's really what the future of the Air Force is going to be. It is not manned aircraft.
Right. I think the Air Force manned aircraft, they still have a role, more of a role than the surface Navy. I think we can see that in both Ukraine and in Iran. But their role has been greatly reduced. Again, their glory days are past. It's because of the advances in air defense. Air defense missiles, even when they're not at all effective against ballistic missiles, they are quite effective. Even the Patriot, is very effective against manned aircraft. And so therefore and then when you're flying low, the man pads present a real threat in lesser systems like that the Iranians have and have had some success with. You can't simply, it's much more difficult to attain air supremacy than it was in the past. And we see that again, like in Ukraine. The aircraft are playing, the manned aircraft are playing a role, but their main role is actually delivering these glide bombs from outside of Ukrainian airspace. I think occasionally they go in, where they're confident there's no air defense, but they don't go in very far. We know that Ukrainian air defenses have been greatly degraded, but they only need a few. So it's sort of like similar to Iran's situation. You just have to have a launcher here or there, that the Russians aren't aware of, and they can lose their manned aircraft over Ukraine. They don't want to risk that, so they stay some distance, and they are effective in launching these glide bombs. So they have more of a role. They are a platform, kind of like actually the ships, because the ships are used as a platform for launching missiles. But the aircraft can get closer. We can see it actually both in Iran and in Ukraine. They are playing a role. Now, again, they're going up against a country. It's not a true peer adversary, but one supplied by peer adversaries, one with a very degraded air defense. Okay, they have to be cautious. Now, if the U.S. were to attack Russia, what could they really do with all their F-35s? I don't think they would dare to fly into Russian airspace, and they would probably be very careful about even getting close to it. In fact, this is what we see. I think with the F-16s that were supplied to Ukraine, they're staying over in Western Ukraine and flying in circles over there, a good distance even from. Their role has been reduced to basically shooting down drones that make it into Western Ukraine. That's what they do, so I think that's very, very illustrative. Now, okay, F-16s are older planes, maybe an F-35 with all its technology and its stealth. Again, we know that that's not perfect. There's no stealth technology, helps to hide a plane, but it can't hide it entirely. Maybe an F-35 could get closer, but I don't think it can get all that much closer. So yeah, it's like there's still a role for the Air Force, but it has been, its glory days are past once again. We are in a new age.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we're in real trouble and there is no way to change paths. So I hate that you have to say that these conversations are to prepare for the day after, just to understand what happened. But it sounds like you think we're going to hit this iceberg, that there is that. It's already baked in.
I just, again, who knows? The history is full of surprises, but, I just kind of run through all the different possible outcomes. And the very best one that I can see seems very unlikely, that the U.S. just walks away in spite of Israel, in spite of, the fact that they're going to lose tremendous credibility. I don't know that the U.S. is capable of really walking away and accepting such a huge loss. And we're not just talking about Trump and his ego, though that's a big part of it, and Netanyahu and the Israeli establishment and their investment in this kind of aura of invincibility. We're not just talking about that. We're also talking about the U.S. Political establishment, the foreign policy establishment. I think even though, now that we're in this war, I don't think they were in favor of it, but now that we're in it, are they going to be able to stomach that kind of loss? And so what does that mean? It means that we may really double down, and then, of course, things just get that much worse for all the reasons that we've described.
Right. Well, I hope the title of our show doesn't become prophetic, that we are going to have conversations among the ruins at one point. It's unbelievable to think of, but that's often where these conversations go, where we talk again and again. And I just can't believe where we see these clear, obvious, catastrophic problems ahead, and we just steam right into them. Okay, well, let's see what happens in China. Maybe something good will come out of that. Okay, I think we ended there. We can save Russia for next time.
Okay, sure.
Okay, have a good rest of your day, Dad.
Okay, you too.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.